Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us today for this webcast presented by Penn State University. Today, our panel will be exploring life science ventures addressing COVID-19, and I will be today's session moderator. I'm Larry Miller, Managing Director of Life Sciences at InnovationWorks and leader of the new Alpha Lab Health Accelerator Program, which is a collaboration between InnovationWorks and the Allegheny Health Network. First, I want to thank our sponsors. We would not be here without their generosity, and we are grateful, very grateful for their support, especially during this very difficult year. Now I'd like to thank the members of our panel and introduce them to you. So as I introduce the members, would you please take a minute or two to introduce yourself? Let me start with Teresa Whalen.
Hi, everybody. I'm Teresa Whalen. I'm the CEO of CytoAgents. I'm a pharmacist by trade and have spent more than 20 years in the life sciences area, initially in the healthcare IT world, and then also worked for two companies that we successfully exited, one in the robotics space and then one in the another healthcare IT space. Happy to be here today.
Thank you, Teresa. Now may I introduce Tim Pelura, CEO of Respana Therapeutics.
Yes, thanks. I'm very happy to be part of this panel. I'm Tim Pelura. I'm the CEO of Respana, and I have a long history in my career of growing early stage companies to profitable and usually rewarding endings for both the investors and for the patients that we're trying to work for. I'm a scientist by training, and about 20 years ago, I moved to the dark side and went to the business side of things. I've started 7 companies, exited 3, and have raised a little over $100 million during that career. Nice to be here.
Thank you very much, Tim. And now, last but not least, Pete DeComo, Chairman and CEO of A-Lung Technologies, Inc.
Thank you, Larry, and good afternoon, everyone. Pleasure to be here with you. I am CEO of a medical device development and manufacturing company in Pittsburgh called A-Lung Technologies. A-Lung actually stands for artificial lung. So our device is an artificial lung that sits outside the body and does about 50% of the work of the native lung when patients have respiratory failure. I've been in the life sciences my entire career. Been involved with numerous startups, been the founder of 4 different startups, exited 2 of those startups, have raised in excess of $120 million, and based on everything that's going on, looking forward to retirement.
I thought I was going to do that before you, Pete. Very good. Those of you in the audience, if you have any questions for the panel during this event, please use the website Q&A function, and then those questions will come to me, and we'll use those questions towards the end of our presentation. We'll do our best to respond to all of your questions. Okay, let's start the panel. What did each of your companies focus on or achieve the most during the period from the shutdown of COVID in March of 2020 till today in the area? And there'll be a few different segments here. In terms of public funding, what did you discover most about public funding during this last year? Let's start with Teresa.
Yeah, well, during the last year, we've been awarded 2 NIH SBIR grants, one in support of our work in influenza, and then most recently in March, we received another $2 million grant for COVID-19 and toxicology work. So that's been a real validation of our science. And in the background, we also were able to oversubscribe our convertible note, and that enabled us to conduct our phase 1 human clinical trials. We just completed our final patient dosing about 2 weeks ago.
Well, that's terrific accomplishment. Thank you. How about in the area of public funding, Tim? What did you see?
Yeah, so I should first say that Respond is a very early company. Just to give you, put this in context, we just last year, we were able to get the license to the technology from Penn State. And it was a fresh startup. We had to establish the team. We were able to get an STTR phase 1 grant. We were awarded the Commonwealth COVID-19 grant. We were able to get a phase 1 venture matching grant to that COVID-19. And we're runner-up to a Millipore Sigma Advanced Biotech grant. So these are small amounts of money, but what we've been able to do with that is to do some critical proof of concept preclinical work. Over my career, I've learned that you don't want to go to the financial markets until you have a real compelling story. And so the next piece of work we're looking at doing is we've taken this monoclonal antibody, which we're developing for influenza and COVID. We've been able to humanize it, and we're going into a humanized mouse. And that'll be kind of the piece of information that most investors want to see.
Very good. Thank you. Pete, how did A-Lung fare with respect to public funding over the last year?
Frankly, and to the point, not very well. Being a medical device, when you look at the public funding that's been available, especially for development of new technologies related to the pandemic, most of that funding has been focused on therapeutics and diagnostics, basically in the area of drug discovery and, of course, diagnostics. Medical device has been low on the totem pole relative to public funding related to the pandemic. In addition to that, we've raised over 120 million of venture capital and high net worth angel money to fund A-Lung to this point. And as a result of that, public funding hasn't been generally available to us. Now, we did benefit from things like the PPP loans, the Payroll Protection Act loans. We actually got 2 of those. And together, both of those totaled almost $1 million. So that was very helpful to the company as well.
Very good. I think from Innovation Works perspective, almost all of the companies that applied for PPP loans did get an amount. Some were small, but some were quite high, like you say, in the 6 digits. PPP program helped a number of our companies. We also got money from the state, $1 million, which we matched on our balance sheet. And we had what we call a COVID resiliency fund. We put out 46 investments in our portfolio companies to help them weather the downturn. Okay, next question. We'll go in reverse order. Regulatory requirements in the USA, Pete. How did those change or not change over the COVID period?
Actually, the pandemic helped us quite a bit. We had just completed a large pivotal trial in the UK, completing a run of 412 patients, a randomized trial. And for the last 4 years, we've been involved in another pivotal trial here in the United States under, of course, the auspices of the FDA. And when the pandemic hit, our device is used solely in the intensive care unit. And of course, that's where COVID patients are, the critically ill COVID patients are being treated. And as a result of that, our clinical trial came to a screeching halt. Now, we have, even though we're not approved in the United States and we're not approved in the European Union, we've delivered treatments to over 1,200 patients worldwide and have not had one unanticipated adverse event during those all of those treatments. That safety record and the fact that we had completed about 2/3 of our clinical trial here in the United States caused the FDA to look at us, and two things happened. One was they approved us for emergency use authorization for COVID-19. And we've been involved worldwide, actually, treating COVID-19 patients with our technology in intensive care units. They also then took us from a class 3 and placed us in a class 2 category for medical device, which no longer then required a PMA type trial, pivotal trial for clearance. And we've submitted a de novo 510(k) application, which is currently under review with the FDA. What that really means for us is that more than likely we'll be approved to go to market in the third quarter of 2021 versus the fourth quarter of 2022. So it changed the whole landscape for us. And I often say, you know, COVID-19 slammed the door on many of us and hit us pretty hard. But in our particular case, it opened the door for us in other ways.
Terrific. I think you know more about the FDA than the FDA knows about the FDA at this point in terms of all the work that you've done with them. And I'm glad that that has helped you. Tim, what was your experience from the regulatory position in the States during the COVID year?
Yeah, well, I guess fortunately or unfortunately, we haven't had any interaction with the FDA because we're just way too early. You know, where we are right now is we're establishing proof of concept, and you know, we're making sure that the things that need to be in place for an eventual regulatory submission are there. So documentation and so forth that's behind all the studies that we've done. But there's quite a bit left for us to do. One of the challenges for a therapy like ours, and again, I mentioned earlier that it's a monoclonal antibody, is that there's a considerable amount of investment required to get you to the point where you can really start to do the regulatory testing, and that's before human beings. We need to have, you know, well-characterized monoclonals and all the control systems in place before we start those preclinical IND-enabling studies. So we will eventually get there. I've brought other monoclonals and recombinant proteins to the clinic. It just will take us time. I guess we're the babies on the panel here.
Very good. All right, Teresa, tell us how you expected any changes in the regulatory environment in the States over the last year.
Yeah, we actually conducted our phase 1 trial in Australia. So our main interaction was with the HREC regulatory body in Australia. And we were able to stand up our phase 1 trial actually rather quickly because we did go to Australia, and they really have made a business of phase 1 trial units. So it was very time efficient, and it was also very capital efficient because we, in Australia, you get 43 cents back on the dollar, and it's not a tax credit. It's actual cash to the company. So we didn't have a lot of interaction with FDA over the course of this last year because we were conducting our study in Australia.
But you believe that the data from your Australia study would be accepted by the FDA?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we did file a preliminary IND with FDA, and we know that the data will be accepted, yes.
Very good. Okay, now I'm going to ask you folks this question, but I want you to respond if you were the head of the CDC. How would you prepare for future pandemics? Each of your companies is not a prophylactic or a vaccine, but you all have therapeutic utility. How would you balance, as the head of the CDC, investments in therapeutics and palliatives versus, say, a drug development, a vaccine? Okay, Teresa, let's start with you.
I mean, I think we need to take a balanced approach. There needs to be, extensive testing, some combination of testing, vaccines, and treatments. Clearly, I have a horse in the race, and our drug is effective. It's a treatment. It's an immune modulator that treats the overreaction of our immune system, and that's really what's driving severe illness. And so our drug, because it's an immune modulator, can be effective across any viral strain that causes respiratory distress. So from our perspective, our drug is a small molecule, it's oral, it's shelf stable, and it does not require refrigeration. So it would be an ideal stockpiling candidate. And we do intend to have those conversations.
Very good. Tim, what
Yeah.
do you think about vaccines versus palliatives and treatments?
Well, I think we all have to remember that vaccines are probably one of the single most important inventions of modern medicine. And I think the last statistic I saw was between 2010 and 2015, somewhere around 10 million people lives have been saved because of vaccines. So I think clearly vaccines have a very, very important place. The challenge with vaccines, though, is that they're specific to the pathogen. And Teresa's company and Respana, we're going at this in a very similar way, that we're going after the host response, which is not specific. It doesn't care what the pathogen is. And so, we're not concerned about the mutations that happen with the various pathogens, since our target is the host, the patient. I think that with regard to preparing for the future pandemics, I think we probably learned as a country, as a public health system, that we have to keep our eye on the ball all the time. And we have to realize that there will be a COVID-21, a COVID-22, or whatever you want to call it. This is going to happen. As long as the virus is out there circulating, it's going to mutate. It's just fundamental chemistry and biology. And so we have to be ready for that. So I agree with Teresa that the approach has to be a combination. We need as many, I should say the physicians need as many tools in the toolbox as possible, which crosses vaccines, therapeutic agents, and of course devices for those people that are really going down a bad path.
Thank you. Pete, same question to you. If you're the head of the CDC, how do you balance vaccines versus palliatives treatments?
I'll probably resign, but before I go well, being a medical device, I'll focus on that. But I do agree with Tim and Teresa. What I think people are recognizing today was that we were ill prepared for COVID-19, number one. We got caught off guard. Not only was the healthcare system not prepared to handle it, manufacturers of therapeutic devices were not prepared to handle it either. You saw the panic around ventilators, both invasive mechanical ventilators and as well as non-invasive mechanical ventilators. I think we need to be more forward-looking in terms of those therapeutics that are available to combat the viruses, because there will be a next one. The great majority of these viruses attack the respiratory system. And regardless of what you do for them, there's going to be a need for invasive and non-invasive mechanical ventilation. And you know, what we're trying to do is not replace the mechanical ventilator, but in essence, assist the mechanical ventilator. When you think about a ventilator, for example, you're putting oxygen into the lungs and therefore into the bloodstream, and you're removing carbon dioxide, which is a byproduct of metabolism. When the lungs aren't working well, getting oxygen across the lung membrane and into the bloodstream is extremely difficult, and getting carbon dioxide out of the blood across the lung membrane so that a patient can exhale it is also extremely difficult. So when you think about an artificial lung, what we're really doing is ventilating the patient by removing carbon dioxide from the blood directly, bypassing the lung, and putting oxygen into the bloodstream directly and bypassing the lung. Mm-hmm. And what we're doing is allowing that lung to rest and heal. And so when it comes to technologies like ours, if I were the CDC director or the FDA, I would try to be more progressive in terms of getting these devices to market sooner. You know, very frankly, we've been involved with the FDA since 2008. It's now 2021, and we're still not approved in the United States. And that can't be the case in the future.
Thank you. So how do you do that planning, though? You all say there's going to be a COVID 2022 or swine flu 2023 or Ebola. Do you stockpile at the federal level some large percentage of the therapeutics? I mean, to me, I go back to the flu model, where I thought that the most effective flu vaccine or shot in any season only addresses 25, 35, 45, 50% of the flu. How can you say that we need to stockpile a bunch of vaccines when we don't even know what the next virus is going to be? On the other hand, to the extent that you have devices that have multiple uses or are host dependent, seems to me it'd be a lot easier or better to stockpile those things and take our chances on the vaccine. Sounds like we can actually develop vaccines fairly quickly. What do we inventory and how much, Teresa?
Yeah, again, I think that it has to be a balanced approach. I mean, I think one thing that we certainly, just diagnostic testing, we were lacking on all fronts, really, testing, vaccines, and treatments. And I think we need to inventory across the board and look for solutions that help the patient, regardless of the pathogen. And there are, to Tim's point and Pete's point, all three of our companies help patients regardless of the virus or regardless of the specific pathogen. And I think there's obviously many companies looking at it from that perspective. Can we bring something more universal to the world?
Very good. Jim, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think one thing that we could probably all agree on is that even in the face of a vaccine that is 100% effective, there are going to be lots of people that just won't take it. And to your point about the influenza vaccine, on a good year we might be 45, 50% effective, but and in that good year, maybe 60% of the population would get the shot. So therein lies a huge problem that goes beyond what we do. It goes to, our education of, how people need to understand how important vaccines are. But I think that, if we continue to develop these kind of non-specific therapies, as is the case with both Teresa and Pete, as is the case with Respana, those are always nice backstops for these situations that we get caught flat-footed. I should also point out that I think future cases or pandemics might be a little easier to address from a vaccine perspective also, because not a lot of people realize that the Moderna and the Pfizer programs were probably 13 or 14 years old. And they had been working on the mRNA approach for all these years. All they had to do was make a very minor change in the protein to address the specific COVID or the SARS-CoV-2 virus. And that's why it was possible that we could get something out so quick. So with those advances, I think, we're going to be better off next time. And hopefully the public will become a little smarter when it comes to public health and personal responsibility and responsibility to the general public.
Pete?
Yeah, well, my situation's a little different being a device, but if you look at and go back to the beginning of the pandemic and think about the panic that occurred around not having enough ventilators, and certainly we learned later that it was an overreaction. But how did you know it was an overreaction when it all started? So, certainly there are ways to assess what kind of stockpiles of medical devices are needed out there to provide support to patients that are affected by pandemics like this. The one nice thing about ventilators and even our technology is that if they're in inventory for long periods of time, as long as batteries are charged and they're turned on once in a while, they're quite effective for many, many years. And even though technology changes, a ventilator is a ventilator. It's been a ventilator for 50 years. They've gotten more sophisticated, of course, but basically they push air into the lung and they allow you to exhale. You can use very rudimentary ventilators, as you saw being developed during the beginning of the pandemic to treat these patients. So, I think the downside of overreaction is if you look at the sales of Philips and Medtronic and others that produce ventilators, they had skyrocketing sales in 20 and the beginning of 2021. They probably won't sell another ventilator for quite a long period of time in the remainder of 21 and 22. So we'll see what happens to their stock prices as a result of that. But they certainly benefited in the short term.
Thank you. Yeah, yes, we saw the period as a tale of two markets. Half of our companies at IW did extremely well because they had products that were addressing COVID or home health care or anything to do with stay-at-home productivity apps, mental health. And yet other companies did very poorly, particularly the ones that were in the middle of fundraising or fundraising stopped, or were doing clinical trials. And the people who were administering the trials and collecting the data were deemed non-essential. We had a number of companies that had to stop with their clinical trial collection. So it was a very almost a bisected market. Tim, you mentioned about education and how even with a vaccine, we probably will have a number of people that require therapeutic help. To me, if I were king for a day and nobody elected me king for a day, once the vaccines were ready, I would have had the state's National Guard and the military be the ones to deliver the vaccines, so that it would be federalized, and we wouldn't be dependent on who's going to be doing that delivery. But how do you standardize the education around, let's just say, pandemics? I think half the country is medically illiterate. I'll put myself in that position as well. For years, I could speak about radiology, but nothing else, and couldn't manage my way around a hospital. How do you get people medically literate and trained and ready to really be approachable and be amenable to taking whatever the vaccine is or whatever the treatment is for our next pandemic?
Yeah. Wow, that is a loaded question.
And I don't mean this to be political at all.
Yeah, but it's hard to pull the politics and the local and the recent kind of, I don't know. It's such a multifactorial question. I think we have to go back to the basics. In our education, early education, it has to be maybe in our early science education, we touch on public health, and so people can understand how important vaccines have been. I mean, I was mentioning this to a friend the other day, that because we were complaining about how difficult it was to find a place to get the COVID vaccine. I remember as a child for getting the polio vaccine, that it was just announced in the local newspaper that you should go to your elementary school that you're associated with through your local taxes on such and such a day at 9 a.m. in the morning, and you'll get your polio vaccine. And I remember that everybody I knew as a little kid showed up at this school and waited in line to get their sugar cube or whatever we got back then. And it just, everything has gotten so complicated. And I think that there has to be, I agree with you that there should be a national a design of the rollout, but it's got to be a directive towards the local institutions, so that the rollout can be more effective. Other than that, I mean, the education, I think, is something that we have to address. Public health and civics 101, which we no longer teach.
Thank you. Teresa, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I agree with Tim that the historical significance of vaccines are really, unfortunately, not well known. And there needs to be more education, and there needs to be some simplification of the message so that people do understand it. I think it's hard. People don't trust what they don't understand. And so I just feel like we need to concentrate on the messaging. I think there needs to be more, education around the safety record of vaccines, which are incredibly safe. But it's just very hard to simplify that into mainstream media messaging. So I think that's, it's a problem. But my personal opinion is we should be vaccinating 24/7, as many people as we can. But, people, have the right to refuse that. And that is their right. But I think a lot of time those decisions are made on bad information, and that's really tragic.
And Teresa, I want to thank you. I understand that you have been trained and you are actually administering of vaccines.
Yeah.
I haven't heard anybody that said that you hurt them or anything like that. So you must.
Yeah, no, it's like the best way to spend your Saturday. Everybody's so happy and grateful and thrilled. It's really rewarding. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Pete, your opinion?
Well, first of all, like Teresa, I agree with Tim, and I also agree with Teresa. There needs to be a significant public education effort around all of this. As Teresa said, there will always be people that, for whatever reason, don't believe a vaccine is safe and don't want to take it. I think the other bit of education is, and being an older gentleman now, probably older than Tim, I remember the polio vaccine as well. And when we were told to get the polio vaccine, we didn't question it. We went and got the polio vaccine. And people don't have that kind of faith today. I have personal friends, highly educated personal friends that I've been in debates with about the safety of the vaccine. And I said, look, if I could have been number one in line in the country, I would have gotten that vaccine. It wouldn't have bothered me a bit. The other thing that I don't think people understand today, and look, I'm not a government control freak or anything like that, but both state and federal government have the responsibility to protect the public's health, safety, and welfare. And when not taking a vaccine or not practicing things like social distancing, wearing masks, and things like that, I mean, frankly, I believe that at times there should be mandates on those types of things when the public's health, safety, and welfare is at stake, and especially for those that don't even believe in a vaccine, because you're protecting them as well, even if they don't realize it. And I know that's all controversial, and I apologize for those who are in the audience that may not agree with what I say, but especially at the beginning of the pandemic, when we were seeing such spikes and the general public's health, safety, and welfare was in jeopardy, I think we, especially in the United States, should have had more control over all of that. And there was no centralized response to it all. And I think that hurt us. And I do believe in states' rights, believe me. So, but we should have had some centralized programs to address all of that.
Very good. Thank you, Pete. And we do have some questions for the audience. For Tim, can you talk about how you found the monoclonal antibodies? Are you pursuing any new methods for antibody discovery? This is from Teresa Buckley from Penn State.
Yeah, so we generated the antibody that we're developing in a very traditional way. We had the protein receptor, and we grew the antibodies to that in mice. We then took the series of antibodies that we generated, and we tested them in vitro systems as well as in animal systems with regard to their potency and ability to protect the animals from both influenza alone, lethal doses of influenza, and influenza in combination with bacterial infection. Once we found the antibody that had the best characteristics, we then went to a contractor that could make the humanized version of that antibody. They generated 22 antibodies for us, and we've whittled that down to between 3 and 5 antibodies that we think are drug candidates. And so we're at this point, the eye is on the prize, so to speak. We are not looking to discover any new antibodies at this point. We have to establish this first program as a success, and then we have ideas where we could take the technology further from there.
So this is a related question, Tim. Highly effective antibodies for COVID-19 have not been rapidly addressed despite pretty compelling data. Is that because of their mode of delivery, e.g. not pills, logistics issues, where to infuse, or something else? This is from Greg Gilbert.
Yeah, well, I think that antibodies in general take a lot longer to generate and get to a therapeutic, druggable antibody for use in humans. And I think that for that reason, you can see that there were a number of hiccups in those programs where they were developing antibodies. Even looking at the convalescent approach, convalescent plasma, where you're using plasma from a patient who presumably was able to overcome COVID, and that by generating their own antibodies. But then, you know, you're dealing with an antibody from a single person that may not have the activity that you want in a broader population. So I think it's just more complicated to take this as an approach for kind of a general therapeutic approach against the virus. And again, that's why we're going after the host response, as is the case with cytoagents and Teresa.
Very good. Thank you very much. Bill Sharp, College Township Industrial Development Authority, wants to thank the panel for their compassion and insight. Thank you, Bill. And then, as we're getting close to the end of the panel, what do you expect the environment to be like for life science ventures as COVID restrictions end? Do you expect a rapid rebound in funding for non-COVID areas, a slow ramp up? This is from Mike Duffy of Kinetic Sciences. Remember, we talk about public funding. What do you think about private funding if COVID goes away in a month or two? Let's start with you, Pete.
I think it's going to come back, absolutely. I think it's, at least my experience has been, and it's, again, focused on device, but even during the pandemic, there's been adequate early stage funding, and there's been adequate late stage funding. It really depends where you're at in the development cycle. And if you're caught between the two ends of a barbell, is where the most difficult funding place happens to be, especially for medical device. Institutional investors are, in my opinion, adverse to risk. They want you to be well on your way to regulatory approval, if not approved. And they want you to be in the market and having shown adoption traction. And you know, it's a significant challenge to get to that point, and you've got to turn over every rock in order to find that kind of funding that allows you to survive until you get there. So early stage and late stage, I think, is going to come back and come back to adequate levels, maybe even strong levels. I think between those two extremes is where it's going to be difficult and continue to be difficult.
Thank you, Pete. And Teresa, I know that you've had some interesting pluses and minuses on private funding with respect to COVID. What's your outlook?
Yeah, we are actively raising our Series A $25 million. And I have to say that it's kind of amazing and disappointing that the investment interest for COVID is, I think there's so much COVID fatigue that it's very hard. And we have been advised very strongly by the investor community to branch out outside of infectious disease into areas whereas the cytokine release syndrome is a problem, but it's not an infectious-driven problem. And that's one reason why we're also focusing on, at the same time, we would like to run a COVID trial, but we're also going to be running a CAR T cell therapy induced CRS trial because the areas in oncology are just frankly more fundable. So we're going after an indication that has more investor interest.
Thank you, Teresa. And I want to thank the entire panel. It's been extremely informative. You folks have been right in the midst of the heat around COVID and have seen it from different approaches. You've been raising money, you've been developing new products, you've been looking for ways to expand the applications of your products. Your knowledge for the regional infrastructure is just great. We really appreciate your time today. I can't thank you enough. I'd also like to thank again all of the 2021 Invent Penn State Ventures and IP conference sponsors for their support, and thank all in the audience for attending today's session. Our next and last event for this evening is a virtual happy hour. It will begin right back here at 5:30 and end at 6:45. We hope that you will join us for this great networking opportunity. Reminder, tomorrow morning's events kick off at 10:30 a.m. and we hope to see you there. Enjoy your evening. Come and enjoy the virtual happy hour and get some good networking. Thank you very much.